The laughter died, but the echo of it hung in the air, ugly and loud. My father's laugh. He was looking right at me, his face flushed with champagne and self-satisfaction. My new husband, Major Ben Carter, just smiled. It was a thin, dangerous smile that never reached his eyes. "Interesting theory, sir," he said, his voice cutting through the sudden silence. Seeing as all my men answered to her, the world seemed to hold its breath for a single beat. Then, the sound. A sharp, singular crack as 6 pairs of heels clicked against the polished floor in perfect unison. The groomsmen, Ben's men, stood ramrod straight, their festive demeanor erased, replaced by masks of stone-cold professionalism. In a single, powerful voice they announced, "Captain Cole, ma'am." But that shocking moment of clarity didn't come from nowhere. It was the culmination of a lifetime of small humiliations, with the most recent one happening just 30 minutes before. We were at the cocktail hour, the air thick with perfume and polite conversation. I saw him holding court, my father, Richard Cole, a retired logistics officer, who believed his service in a bygone era made him an expert on everything. He was talking to Ben's commanding officer, Colonel Thompson, a man whose quiet presence commanded more respect than my father's booming voice ever could. As Ben and I approached, my father slung a heavy arm around my shoulders, his grip just a little too tight. "This one plays soldier," he announced to the colonel, winking as if sharing a private joke. "But we all know who the real leader in the family is." I stood there, a statue in a white dress, feeling the familiar heat crawl up my neck. I kept my expression perfectly neutral, a skill I'd honed more at family dinners than in any training exercise. The internal ledger started flipping through pages. My high school graduation, my officer commissioning every holiday. Always the same dismissive tone, the same condescending pat on the head. This was just another entry. "She pushes papers at some supply depot," my father continued, chuckling to himself. "Good for her, keeps her busy." I risked a glance at Colonel Thompson. He gave nothing away, just a tight, unreadable smile. He was the man who, just 72 hours earlier, had read my after-action report for Operation Nightfall, a report written in blood, sweat, and jet fuel, detailing a mission so classified my own father would never even hear its name. My father thought he was making a joke. I thought about the lives that depended on the papers I pushed. He chuckled, patting my shoulder as if I were a child who'd just won a spelling bee. He had no idea he'd just dismissed my entire career in front of the man who approved my operational budget. To understand the public correction that was about to take place, you have to understand. The war I was fighting on 2 fronts, one overseas and one at my own family dinner table. To understand that moment at the wedding, you have to understand that for the better part of a decade, I had been living 2 completely different lives. In one life, I was Evelyn Cole, the disappointing daughter, the perpetual afterthought. In the other, I was Captain Cole, a call sign, a commander, an officer whose decisions meant the difference between life and death. The border between those 2 worlds was a line I never allowed to be crossed, until I realized one world was slowly destroying the other. The contrast was never sharper than it was 2 Christmases before the wedding. The whole family was gathered, the air thick with the scent of pine and my mother's simmering anxiety. The entire evening was an altar built to my brother, Mark, the family's golden boy, who wore his charisma like a shield. He had just been promoted to a mid-level marketing manager, and had landed some regional advertising account. To hear my family talk about it, you would think he had personally brokered world peace. They hung on his every word as he described presentations and client dinners. And my father beamed with a pride so intense it was almost blinding. The celebration culminated in him receiving a brand new Rolex, a reward for his hard work. I watched the whole spectacle with a familiar hollow feeling in my chest. The internal ledger was running, as always. I saw the watch, but I also saw the university textbooks I had to buy myself, the busted car I had to pay to fix, the countless times I was told money is tight when I needed something essential. Later that evening, trying to connect, trying to share a piece of my own life, I quietly mentioned to my father that I had just been awarded the Bronze Star. He was on his 3rd glass of whiskey. He turned, clapped me hard on the shoulder. and gave me that familiar, condescending smile. "That's nice, honey," he boomed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably for keeping the pencils sharp, eh?" The room filled with laughter. Not cruel laughter, but the easy, thoughtless laughter of people who had already accepted the family narrative. I was Evelyn the admin, the girl playing soldier. I felt my face turn to stone, my posture becoming ramrod straight, the only way I knew how to contain the rage. My mother, Susan, a woman who believed family peace was more important than fairness, quickly shuffled me into the kitchen. "You know how your father is," she whispered, wringing her hands. "He's from a different time. He's just proud in his own way. You don't need to be so sensitive." But it wasn't a different time, and it wasn't pride. It was a willful ignorance I had enabled for far too long. He didn't want to see me as I was, because my reality didn't fit into his comfortable, outdated worldview. He was Richard Cole, a retired major who'd peaked in the 90s and believed modern warfare was a clean, simple thing fought by men exactly like him. My service, in his eyes, was just a pale imitation of his own real career. A hobby. But while they were toasting Mark's advertising campaign, my real life was unfolding, half a world away, under the cold blue light of a tactical operations center. This was my sanctuary, my reality. The air hummed with the sound of servers and smelled of stale coffee and controlled tension. There I wasn't Evelyn the admin. I was the mission commander for a critical nighttime resupply. I remember one night in particular, staring at a bank of monitors showing grainy drone footage. A special forces team was running low on ammo, deep in hostile territory, with enemy patrols closing in. My voice was low and calm, cutting through the quiet chaos. "Listen up," I said into my headset, my words being broadcast to pilots and ground crews miles away. "My QRF is on a 10-minute standby. I need confirmation that the LZ is cold before we release the assets. We are weapons tight until I give the go code. Acknowledge." In that room, my judgment was absolute. And watching me from the corner was my mentor, General Matthews, a man with 3 decades of command experience and eyes that missed nothing. He didn't offer praise or loud congratulations. He just watched me work. And when the mission was over, when the team was safe and the assets were back, he gave me a single, slow nod. That one nod from him was worth more than a lifetime of my father's empty compliments. It was real. This was the world where I belonged, the world I had built for myself in silence. It was the world I introduced to my husband, Major Ben Carter, an infantry commander who had been on the receiving end of one of my operations. He saw my brilliance firsthand, not as a curiosity, but as a life-saving force. He was the one person who saw both worlds, and was quietly furious at the injustice of it all. For years, I let him have his narrative. I built a wall between my 2 worlds, thinking it was easier. But when he chose my wedding day to mock my uniform in front of my men and my commanding officers, I realized the wall had to come down. He didn't respect the woman. It was time to see if he respected the rank. The decision to bring my 2 worlds together wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a calculated strategic choice. It was made a month before the wedding, in the quiet of our small apartment, with stacks of ivory-colored invitations on the dining table. Ben, my fiancé, picked up the one addressed to my parents. He looked at me, his expression full of a concern that I knew was genuine. "Are you sure about this, Evie?" he asked, his voice low. "We could just elope. Fly to Hawaii, get it done. You don't have to put yourself through that." For a moment, I was tempted. The thought of a quiet ceremony, free from the weight of my family's judgment, was peaceful. I looked at my father's name, written in elegant calligraphy. The internal ledger of 1,000 slights and 1,000,000 condescending remarks started to scroll through my mind. I could just leave it all behind. But then, something shifted. The hurt gave way to a cold, clear focus, the same focus I get when planning a complex operation. This wasn't about running away from the problem anymore. It was about solving it. I looked at Ben. "No," I said, my voice steady. "He needs to be there. And so do your groomsmen." This wasn't a trap I was setting, it was the simple, perfect application of military protocol in a civilian setting. I explained the plan to Ben, who at first thought I was seeking some kind of loud confrontation. I assured him it was the opposite. The groomsmen he'd chosen weren't just his buddies. They were the core members of his unit, men I had personally directed and supported during Operation Nightfall. This was the harrowing mission, where a breakdown in the supply chain nearly got them all killed. My logistical strategy, executed from thousands of miles away, was the only reason they made it home. They didn't just respect me, they held me in a state of awe born from a shared life-threatening experience. The final piece was put into place with a single phone call. Ben later told me exactly how it went. He called his best man Sergeant Miller, a soldier whose loyalty was forged in the crucible of combat. "Sergeant," Ben said, his voice leaving no room for misunderstanding, "on the day, your men will be my groomsmen. But if and when Captain Cole is addressed disrespectfully, you will revert to protocol. You will address her by her rank and title. Is that understood?" There was no hesitation on the other end of the line. The sergeant's voice was firm, resolute, and filled with a profound sense of purpose. "Sir, it would be our honor." I wasn't planning an ambush, I was planning a moment of absolute clarity. My father lived in a world of assumptions and outdated pride. I was simply inviting him into my world, a world governed by a simple, unbreakable rule: rank has its privilege and respect is not optional. The wedding reception was a masterclass in polite fiction. Everything from the ivory tablecloths to the carefully arranged flowers was designed to present a perfect, unbroken surface. I sat at the head table next to my new husband, a bride in white, feeling less like a participant and more like a strategist in a command center, watching the final pieces of an operation move into place. My mother was fluttering with nervous energy, my brother Mark was schmoozing with the bridesmaids, and my father was soaking it all in, the proud patriarch presiding over his domain. He'd had just enough champagne to be jovial, and just enough whiskey to be cruel. When he stood up and tapped his glass for the toast, a hush fell over the room. I placed my hands in my lap and prepared myself. He started with the classics, a few jokes about Ben joining the family. Then he turned his attention to me. "You know," he began, a broad, theatrical smile on his face, "I remember when little Evie was about 7 years old. She tried to climb the old oak tree in our backyard, got about halfway up, and came tumbling right down." He paused for the expected laughter, landed flat on her back, couldn't breathe. I had to run out and scoop her up. In my mind, the memory played out differently. I remembered the scrape of bark on my skin, the thrill of getting higher than Mark ever did, and the frustrating shock of the fall. The part he always left out was that 5 minutes later I started climbing again. But in his story, I was fragile. I was the clumsy little girl who needed her father to save her. It was the only version of me he was ever willing to see. He raised his glass, his voice booming through the microphone. "So, I want to make a toast. To Ben, for finally giving my little girl a real purpose, and for being there to catch her when she falls. Lord knows pushing pencils for Uncle Sam, wasn't it?" A smattering of polite, uncomfortable laughter rippled through the room. My hands remained perfectly still in my lap. I could feel Ben's stillness next to me. A coiled spring of readiness. My father, feeling the surge of attention, turned to a table of his old veteran buddies, winking at them. "Am I right, boys?" he shouted, his voice thick with condescension. "Don't think a woman can lead soldiers, can you?" That was it. That was the trigger. His laughter was loud and ugly, and it broke the polite fiction of the evening. The DJ, a young kid who looked terrified, instinctively faded the soft music out. A heavy, profound silence descended upon the room, broken only by the echo of my father's arrogance. And in that silence, Ben stood up. He didn't look angry. He looked calm. He was an officer in complete control of the situation. He looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the line with surgical precision. "Interesting theory, sir. Seeing as all my men answer to her," he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to his best man, Sergeant Miller. What happened next was not a performance. It was a drill. 6 groomsmen, strategically positioned around the reception hall, moved as one. Drinks were placed silently on tables. They pivoted on their heels, executing a flawless military-facing movement to address me. The sound of their dress shoes hitting the polished floor was a single, sharp crack, a sound that cut through the silence like a rifle shot. They snapped to the rigid, unwavering posture of attention. Their hands, which moments before had been holding glasses, came up in a salute. So crisp, so unified, it was a thunderclap of pure, undiluted protocol. "Captain Cole, ma'am." The words hit the room, not as a shout, but as a formal declaration. My father's smug smile didn't just fade, it collapsed. I watched the stages of his reality breaking apart, playing out on his face in slow motion. First, the slack-jawed confusion, his eyes darting between me and the 6 soldiers standing like statues honoring me. Then came the frantic search for an explanation, his gaze landing on Colonel Thompson. The colonel didn't flinch. He simply raised his own glass an inch off the table and gave a single, slow nod of endorsement. It was a confirmation. This was real. Finally, the confusion curdled into a dawning, sickening horror. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, sweaty mask of disbelief. His veteran friends weren't laughing. They were sitting bolt upright, their old instincts awakened. They recognized the gesture for what it was, not a joke, not a stunt, but an act of profound, earned respect from active duty soldiers to a commanding officer. My father was holding the microphone in a hand that had started to tremble. He, who had built his entire identity on the bedrock of military authority, had just been publicly and utterly undermined by the very system he worshipped. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply sat there, a bride in a white dress, and watched the truth finally and irreversibly report for duty. He had spent my entire life trying to put me in my place. In the end, all it took was 6 men and 3 words to show him exactly what my place was. The silence that followed the salute was more profound than any noise. For a long moment the 6 men stood frozen, a line of unwavering respect aimed directly at me. I gave a single, slight nod, and just as they had risen, they relaxed in perfect unison. My father simply stared, his face a hollow mask. He lowered the microphone, not placing it on the table, but letting it drop from his fingers. It hit the wood with a loud, ugly clatter that seemed to startle him, as if he'd forgotten he was holding it. He sank back into his chair, a man whose spine had suddenly turned to dust. My mother, her face pale and pinched, rushed to his side, whispering things I couldn't hear. They didn't make a scene. They didn't say a word to me. Within the hour they were gone, slipping out a side exit like ghosts leaving their own haunting. The space they left was immediately filled, not with the suffocating weight of family obligation but with the warmth of genuine camaraderie. My true peers. Colonel Thompson was the first to approach. He took my hand in a firm shake, his eyes meeting mine with an expression of absolute professional approval. "Captain," he said, his voice low and clear. "Well done." That was it. No grand pronouncements, just a simple acknowledgement from one officer to another, and it was more validating than anything my father had ever said to me. Then came the groomsmen, led by Sergeant Miller. Their formal demeanor was gone, replaced by broad, genuine smiles. They raised their glasses to me, one by one. Their toasts weren't the generic wedding fluff. They were real. "To Pathfinder," one of them said, his voice thick with emotion. We were flying blind in the dark until she lit the way home. The reception was no longer about a wedding. It had transformed into a celebration of a leader among her people. 6 months later, the memory of that night felt like it belonged to another lifetime. I stood on a podium in the cavernous expanse of an airfield hangar, the air smelling of jet fuel and cold steel. Behind me, the massive tail of a C-130 loomed like a skyscraper. On the breast of my flight suit, stitched in neat professional lettering, was my call sign, Pathfinder. I was briefing a joint task force, a sea of serious faces belonging to some of the most elite soldiers, sailors, and airmen in the world. My voice was steady, confident, moving through the complex logistics of the upcoming operation with an authority that was now as natural to me as breathing. There was no Evelyn the admin here. There was only Captain Cole. My husband, Ben, was in the third row. He wasn't my husband in that moment, but Major Carter, another officer in the briefing, a notepad open on his knee, listening with the same focused attention as everyone else. I caught his eye for a brief second, and the look he gave me wasn't one of husbandly affection. It was a look of pure, unadulterated professional respect, the quiet acknowledgement of a peer who knew exactly what it took for me to be standing on that stage. In that moment, I knew I had built a life and a partnership founded on a truth far stronger than blood or obligation. It was a foundation of mutual, earned respect. Later that week, I was in my office, working late. The only sounds were the quiet hum of my computer and the scratch of my pen across a satellite map. My phone buzzed on the desk, a jarring intrusion into the focused silence. I glanced at the screen and felt a jolt. It was a text from my father. The first since the wedding. My hand hesitated over the phone. But the old anxiety was gone, replaced by a calm, detached curiosity. I opened the message. It was short. Evelyn, saw an article about Operation Nightfall. They mentioned Pathfinder. Was that you? I read the words over and over. It wasn't an apology. It was a question born of shattered pride and forced acknowledgement. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, he was seeking confirmation that the world he thought he knew was truly gone. And as I stared at that message, I felt the last heavy entry in my internal ledger finally dissolve into nothing. I didn't need the apology anymore. His validation was a currency I no longer traded in. I took a slow, deep breath, placed the phone screen down on the desk, and turned back to the map. My work was waiting. A small, resolved smile touched my lips. The peace was absolute, and it was mine.